Okay, Grandma. So I think we'll start with some questions from Mike.
Okay.
Okay. So first question: as a young girl, did you dream about living in the city or did you prefer the farm?
That is a very interesting thing that one would ask. I tell you why. I used to look at the comic books because we didn't have TV for a long time.
Uh huh.
And I used to dream about what it would be like with the places where they showed the girls sitting in the little cute cafeteria and drinking milkshakes or sodas or something,
Yeah.
and thought how clever that would be. And I just thought that was absolutely the place that everyone would want to be. I didn't think about what city life was like. I didn't really let myself go there as far as think about it a lot. But that picture is still in my mind that I used to think that would be a very fun thing, and I
What
was
comic?
missing out.
What comic do you mean? Like in the
You know, I
newspaper?
can't remember. It probably something like Blondie and Dagwood, but something that I
Oh,
would have
okay.
seen a cartoon of, and the girls sitting with another friend or maybe another little fella there at the table, but just having fun, chit chatting. I didn't think about the fact that life is not really that all day long,
Mm-hmm.
and they had to go home to a house in a town and what that would be like. But I just used to kind of dream about that and say, oh, that's just the ideal thing until later.
Did you and Punky ever like talk about that? Like, oh,
Um, we just chit chatted about maybe something that was in a story, but not really that. No, we didn't really talk about a lot. But later, I found out that was not the place to be, and I was so fortunate I had a life that I did. But I didn't know it until later.
yeah,
That's part of life's learning process to
sure.
know that later in life you find out what you had was really special.
Yeah. No, I mean,
Yeah,
living on the farm, that's
yeah,
amazing.
it was different.
What was your favorite season on the farm?
The season,
Yeah.
well, it has to be one that I've heard people comment about, even nowadays, spring and fall. And there were winters that I can remember that have a really special memory for me, but I can't say they were wonderful because, as I told you before, our house was always pretty cold,
Mm-hmm.
except in front of that stove.
Yeah.
And we only had the kitchen stove running because it took wood or coal, and we only had it running during mealtime preparation. And this is an absolute truth. I can remember in the evening time after supper and washing the dishes and it cooling down so much in the kitchen that the dishwater would get uncomfortably cool on our hands to finish washing dishes, and that is cold.
Yeah. Wow.
So your body kind of climatizes, and you adapt
Mm-hmm.
to the different temperatures of the season. You can tolerate heat a little bit better once you've been in it for a little while, but you can also tolerate cold a little bit better, when you've been there for a good time. So, anyway, those two.
Cool. Did you like living in Cincinnati during your schooling, or did you wish you were back on the farm?
Well, that's another interesting thought. I was so homesick when I went to nurses school, and the Cincinnati was not a dreamy place to go to. I just rode down on the bus to the main station and then got a city bus up the hill to my school
Mm-hmm.
when I would go home after a weekend, off. But the place where I lived was in the hospital became like a slum area around it. It was really kind of frightening.
Really?
And as I might have said this before, but after we got off duty, anytime in the evening or nighttime shift, the guard would offer to walk us out to our car. And I could walk to across the street and it was total slums. I kid you not.
Across the street from the hospital.
Yes, right in front of the hospital.
Wow.
And at in the evening, when before they built the tunnel back, the tunnel was not really functional for a couple of the years when I was a student, and then they finally finished it. But it was a way you could go downstairs in the nurse's dorm in the basement and walk under and through a tunnel over to the hospital, and then go up on an elevator into the work area.
Really?
And that was a very good safety thing. So, in the nurse's dorm, someone came up to our floor every so many hours and walked the floor and looked in and out the far view windows just to make sure things were all still secure and safe.
Wow.
Yes, it was.
They had a tunnel for you guys.
Yes, we had a tunnel.
Huh.
We had a thing that was written about in the paper. If I could find a story about it, I would love to share it with you. But there was a phenomenal X-ray department that had a piece of equipment that was the depth of, I think it was 2 stories deep. And part of it was down in that same level as the tunnel we went through. And it was like D level or something like that. And then it went up to B, C, and then A, and whatever to the main floor. But anyway, it was something that didn't survive its fame all that long, because I don't know that it's still there. I don't know about that. It was giant, though, piece of equipment.
Okay, next question. What was the best and worst part of being a preacher's wife?
The best and the worst. Well, I tell you, I had the most wonderful husband who was always as he appeared to be outside of home as he was in the home. So I appreciated that. And I have come to appreciate it and understand it better even now that he's not here anymore, because I hear of stories of, what people endure. Some of the worst things I can tell you are by well-meaning people who come and tell you things about someone else and what they said, maybe in a hurtful kind of spirit, and think they're doing you a favor, because that causes a lot of pain, and you wish that you could really trust that everyone was what they appeared to be, but that was painful. So I don't know if anybody else will ever hear that would benefit from it, but if it is one of those hard things in life to endure. So I guess that answered the thing that you wanted to know there.
Yeah. What's one food that you miss from your childhood?
One
Food.
food that I miss.
Yeah, maybe like a meal or something. Or
I'm gonna say the home cured hams and sausages that my dad would make, and I liked greens a lot. And there was one thing I'll share with you about greens. In the springtime, when things are fresh and newly sprouted up, you walk through the fields, and someone who knows all the different names of the greens could maybe share this, but you pick a few of different kinds of greens. Like, you pick a little bit of dandelion, you pick a little bit of lamb's leaf or lamb's quarter, and there was a mixture of those. It made the absolute best greens that you ever want to have,
Wow.
It is just fine. So I think some of those would be, and my mom also made a thing called fried dried apple pies. That's where the apples are dehydrated, and it gives a different flavor from all the regular apples that you could buy in a store.
Yeah.
But they're dehydrated and then rehydrated, add a little bit of sugar, not a lot of seasoning because they have a different flavor. They're real kind of tart and a deep apple flavor. And then you put like a crust around them, and then you fry them. It's just delicious.
Oh.
That was one of the good things. She made a great jam cake too, but I watch a little bit of the sugar I take in now, so I can't let myself get too over the hill with that.
Yeah.
Mom was famous for making wonderful pies, cream pies, like chocolate cream pie or vanilla or banana cream. And when they would take a pie to donate at the church sales,
Yeah.
someone would buy a piece of her pie and come back and want the whole thing.
Really?
She was well known for good pies.
Wow.
So I guess I should say I missed that too.
You missed the
Yeah.
pies.
Yeah.
Nice. What were the last question? What were the county fairs like?
Oh, the county fairs. It was a place where you'd be off school, and that was an extra benefit. The fairs happened just a couple of weeks or so after school started, and it was a great break because you had to wait until it was cool enough in the fall to have the animals in the buildings, and
Right.
all the produce and all that. But anyway, it was just an enjoyable thing that if we got to ride on the Ferris wheel, that was gingerbread, but that frightened me too. Or the merry-go-round, that was really fun. But even as a grown-up, you like those things. And so anyway, the bus would take us over
Hmm.
as a school event. And I'll tell you something about the fair and what happened when I was a freshman in high school and became a cheerleader.
Okay.
We had to wait for the fair to be over, and had a consequence for me.
Oh man.
But anyway, that's in a different era of time. But the fair was just delightful. It was just a place to walk around and see other people's canned goods or their homewares or their quilts. And that's another thing I can share with you one day, some of Mom's quilts.
Yeah.
But the fair was wonderful. It was a great 4 or 5 days of fun.
And what county was that?
Brown County.
Brown County.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's the one we went to.
Was it far? How far was it from?
It
from
was
where you
in
lived?
Georgetown,
Okay.
and that was either 12 or 14 miles because Mom drove there later, for her work at the hospital, the Georgetown Hospital, and she would drive there, and that's kind of how we figured out the mileage. It was 12 or 14 miles,
Okay.
and it was just really enjoyable. We also enjoyed going to the cattle barns, seeing the pigs and the calves and the cows and the horses and who got blue ribbons. Oh, that's right. The 4-H group would enter in a little project, and so anybody that belonged to 4-H, we'd go get to see our stuff and how it
Wow. So
It went in the
4-H
fair.
has been around a long time then.
a long time.
Wow.
Yeah, really. It was a thing that kind of went on during the summer, I think, and then by fall you were ready to make your little project and put it in the fair and see
Wow.
how you rated. And they would come by and grade all that stuff and give it a ribbon or
Would everybody
nothing.
watch during the grading process?
No, that happened in private, so nobody kind of knew whose was what, and it was all done fairly. So unless somebody recognized the name, which I don't have a clue,
Yeah, yeah.
and I don't know that the names were on them. So
Wow. So
that was fun.
what other kind of rides did they have at the fair? Merry-go-round, Ferris wheel.
There might have been something still for the younger children, like those little cars that they do. Sit in a little car and run around.
Yeah.
One time there was a train. I had a picture of me on a train, and I was so apprehensive that I was always turned looking for my mom and dad while I was riding the little thing but that was years earlier when I was very young,
Oh, that's fun.
and it's in there somewhere.
Okay. Did you have some pictures you wanted to show me?
I do.
Yeah. Let's take
I
a look.
had talked about the fact that I would categorize the places of my memory for our history event here
Okay.
by the title of the farm where we lived. And I did not have this picture until last week. And I told you about living in a very large house that had a dining room that was like 42 feet long
Yeah.
and was called the Weaver Farm. So I found a picture of that farm, and on the back it says it was home to us near Minerva, Kentucky for 9 years.
Wow.
So that was written by my mother, and here's a picture of the house. That's the Weaver Farm.
Before you show me this, you want to tell me about this photo?
Oh, yeah, that's a picture of the far left is my grandfather, my mother's dad, and the second lady in the front on the right would be his mother, Granny Hall. That's the lady who took care of my mother when she was 14 months old after her mother died, and was in our life very, very personally for many years until she died. But that would be my grandfather. We call him Papaw. And the fourth person on the right, the second lady with the lighter hair and the little bun on her head, was Granny Hall. And that's a picture of the farmhouse that I told you was in near Minerva. And I just found out that Minerva has a great multitude of 60 folks in it even right now. That's how big it is. So that means if you had 4 or 5 people in one family, so to speak, that's how big it is. Even today, I looked it up on Google.
Wow.
Yeah. And this picture had to have been taken at the same place, and that would be my brother and me, because we were there for 9 years, so I can tell our ages, and that would be me on the smaller roadster.
Yeah. That's a good one.
Yeah. And this is another picture that would have been taken there. That's my brother and me on the far right. He's sitting on the ground looking at the wagon, and that's me standing behind him with the white hair. And those folks that were visiting were called the Likens children. They were nearby neighbors, good friends, and
These ones on the left?
the ones standing up and the one in the wagon. So that would have still been at the same farm, judging from the age of the size my brother and I were.
Wow.
And that was another picture at the same place. And the car in the background is a white fancy car that would have belonged to Frank and Ida McCann, who would come and visit us often. They were relatives on my mother's side of the family, very, very loving people, and came up from Cincinnati area. And I can remember one thing about Frank that I did not recall the last session we had. Frank worked in a steel mill in the Covington area of Kentucky. And one of the most interesting things I can tell you about the fact that he related to us later in years was the fact that when there was an accident, sometimes people fell into a vat. And he said it was very respectfully done, but he said there was just literally a fume because the steel was so molten, and it was probably before they had good OSHA regulations about, guards and protection
People
around.
Just fell into molten
It
steel?
happened, evidently happened, yes.
Wow.
And he shared that with us. And so
That's terrifying.
it is. It's a very awful thing to think about.
Wow.
So now there's another picture. I don't know whether to make it a grouping of like family time or some older pictures in there. This is a picture of that little one there, Sugar. Yeah, that is my dad's mother, Hannah Emmons. And I can get some of the historical background for her husband's name. I have no pictures of him. He's was gone ever and before I was born, I think.
Wow.
And people often, had a bad illness and died in those days. When a person got really sick, they didn't go to a hospital. They just kind of suffered, and if the doctor came and gave them treatment, they would maybe get through whatever it was they had, and sometimes they just didn't survive and live very long lives.
Wow.
They would be home and in bed a lot. So anyway, that's the way that worked.
Did you want to go over these?
Yeah, that would be all right. Go ahead for that one.
Yeah, now that we got a different camera set up this time, so it should be a little better.
That is a picture of my papa after he bought that filling station that I mentioned in the last session about him doing that selling of his half of the farm. He invested in the filling station.
Right.
And I have come to understand why that might have been thought of as a fairly possible good venture. And my dad did not even get all that upset about it. But that was at the top of the Maysville Hill. And the next picture I'll show you is the reason why he might have had the courage to do that or went off into that venture. This is a different picture of one of my mother's half-sister's father-in-law. His name was Uncle Ben Watson. And that is him at his filling station, which he operated for many, many years. And that's a picture of my dad to his left. And of course, that's my brother, and then me, and Papa on the right. And I'm thinking that might be why Papa had the courage to buy into like a filling station as a hopeful thing to, be a successful way of life.
Yeah.
And so it might have been understandable a little bit better because of that. And the next picture is a picture of, I think that's my brother and me, sitting at the side of my papa's filling station. If you move over from the hoses, and then to the right,
Yeah.
and then in the back of that little building was a place I described before, where they had special little table for folks of color to sit, and I like to sit back there with our hired hand, Russ Gillum, and eat my chili with him.
Oh, wow.
So that was the era of time, and that was while we lived on the Pfizer farm. That's this after the Weaver farm. You see, we're growing up a little bit there. So that's just another picture of, I think that's my dad. Yeah, that's my dad. And he was sitting out there and allowed Mom to take his picture, evidently. Well, and that's just a duplicate, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The same one that we had before.
You want to do, who's this?
That is Anna Louise. I'll tell you, this is part of history, but Anna Louise was already gone by the time I was grown up. I had always thought that was a picture of Mother, and then I saw on the frame that it was Anna Louise. That was Mother's sister. She was a full sister.
Wow.
And the interesting thing about her is that she and Mom were in the orchard walking one day, and she says, "Lib, I don't think I'm going to be here very long." And in 2 weeks she was deceased, and she was that young. She was married to one of my relatives we called, I got to think of his name. But anyway, she was married, and her husband married another lady after she was gone, and she became the good mother of the daughter. But the famous thing about him is he had a little bit too much sauce one day.
Too much sauce?
Yes,
What does that mean?
liquor.
Oh.
And he was driving and ready to cross from Aberdeen to Maysville. I started to say he was Uncle John Cropper, but it's not. Anyway, he ran into the edge of the Maysville Bridge, and there was a dent in the railing that looks over the left, and we always laughed when we drove past that because we knew who had made that dent.
Oh, no.
And it took them a long time before they ever repaired that. I remember driving over it for years and years and years. Oh, and by the way, I would like to share the bridge that goes from Maysville to Aberdeen, back and forth, of course, was a place where we always had to stop at a little pay station and pay to go across the river.
Really?
Yes, across the bridge for many, many years. And only in the last, well, I don't know, we were probably way in our teens before that stopped.
How much was it?
It was probably like 25, 35 cents.
Wow.
But it helped, gradually to pay for the bridge. And that's been for years. It was a nice bridge, too. And since then, they built a fancy, fancy bridge a few miles down the road.
Good deal.
Well, that's just a picture of, I don't know if that's me or my brother, at the, it had to be the Weaver farm because of the age. Now I'm remembering that I didn't know that we were there for 9 years. So that would be, there's one of my brother and one of me. We look so much alike in those pictures on the horse. Oh, and that's my dad. I have to tell you a story about my dad that was such a delightful thing. He had a brother named Tipton, and I'll show you his picture in a minute. This is his brother, Uncle Tip, and when I looked up on the ancestry, they did not mention his name. Before we're all done, I will get all the historical family names listed down for you. But they mentioned Rufus and Benny and all kinds of names, did not mention Tipton. And I found out later his name they thought was an L, Lipton. So anyway, he was in the war, and I guess he was older than my dad. But after the war, he met a lady that he married, and so he hadn't been back home for a good while. And after the war was over, he moved to Nebraska. So I found out on the back of these pictures when these were taken, and it makes it very interesting. This is a picture. The story is this. My dad had not seen him for many years, and he knew his address. They communicated with Mom and Aunt Elsie and so forth, but they communicated but hadn't seen each other. So my dad planned a visit. He rode out on the train to Nebraska and went to the town, and Uncle Tip at that time had become like a chief of police, whatever it was. And it was a very good custom in those days that when someone strange came to town to visit, the police would inquire, why are you here? Who are you visiting? Because they wanted to be protective and take care of people in the right way. So they found out that my dad was the brother, but my dad wanted to play a trick on his brother. He hadn't seen him. And so they took him to Uncle Tip and said, "We found this vagrant." It says, "We just don't know what he's up to, and we're trying to figure out what to do with him, whatever." And so Uncle Tip started to question him, and my dad was having fun saying really goofy answers, like being smart aleck with him, defiant or whatever. And finally, my dad said, "You don't know your own brother." And so they had such a happy reunion, and he went to their house and stayed a few days. And this is a picture, and it happened in 1936. So that would be the surprise time when he went to visit Uncle Tip. And then actually, it was just a real fun story. He just loved to tell that story. And I don't know if that's why he liked to have this cowboy outfit, because they were in a western setting or whatever it was. But that was my dad too. He liked to take pictures looking like a cowboy, I guess. And Rod and I went and visited Uncle Tip when we made one of our cross-country travels, as a married couple. But this is Uncle Tip and his wife, Maxine. Or Maxine was their daughter. And he was so happy to see my dad. It was just a great opportunity to visit and whatever.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that a fun story?
That's nice. I like that. Let's see. We got one more here. This tractor. Which one's this?
Oh, that was something that I wanted to show you, what kind of equipment had to be used on the farm when they did the harvesting of different kinds of things. You can tell that was hay baler, I believe, if I can see it right, because it looks like that kind of growth in front of the thing. They would put hay down into a kind of a trough, I guess you would call it, and they would compact it and push it out in a square, long thing called a bale. And one of our boys that lived next door to us in Ohio, you put a wire through it at a certain point, so the wire goes around and clamps and holds the bale of hay together. And he lost his finger in that. It was a sad time.
Really?
Yes, his name was Bender.
Oh.
And so
Wow.
that was a sad event. But that's just to show some of the equipment from the day, the kind of time where they lived.
Let's see. Do you have any more pictures?
Um,
Or none for now?
I could. This is a fairly good picture of my papa, and to show you the kinds of cars we had in the early days. That wasn't his car. He never drove. He's the one on the right, the older gentleman. And this is my dad's sister, Aunt Elsie, who took care of her mother all her life and never did marry.
This is Aunt Elsie?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is not an easy picture to see, so I don't even know whether to share it with you, but
Let's give it a gander.
give it a try, and I'll tell you who the people are at least. The age of time. It would have had to have been the Weaver farm, because that's me on the far right, the little baby part. That's Papa. That's my brother in front of him. And that is Frank McCann, the one I told you about who worked in the steel mill.
Oh yeah.
And then Granny Hall, she was still living, see there. And then there's Ida, that's Frank's wife. And then my mother holding me. And I can't see who's in the background. But anyway, that would have had to been on the Weaver farm to show you. And they came to see us quite often. They were very loving people. So, oh, and this one I want to show you. This was that is a picture of my mother.
Wow.
Yeah, probably near the time when she got married. I'm guessing. It was that was a time when there was a picture of her on top of a car photographed, and she was the one who was brave to drive everybody's car, and they would call up and say, "Can Elizabeth come over and drive our car to town for us," or whatever, until they felt secure enough to do that.
When is this from?
Probably, I'm guessing Mom was probably 22 or 3 there, something like that.
That's an old photo.
Oh yeah.
Wow. This is original, right?
Yeah. Mhm. It had to have been in a frame like that fold-over thing, because that's what I was looking for when I searched for her picture, when I thought it was the other gal, Anna Louise.
Wow.
Anyway.
Okay. Well, we'll jump back into your story.
Okay.
So you said you were probably 2nd or 3rd grade at the farm that had a phone.
Yes.
And which farm was that?
That was the Lewisburg area.
Okay.
We had a phone, and that was the Fred Adams farm, which we had such great memories of that farm. Oh, I've got another picture I'll show you that happened at that farm, which might be of interest to you.
Sure.
This is another picture of my Granny Hall. She did not live at that farm with us. She was gone at the Pfizer farm. She's the one on the right, Granny Hall.
Wow.
And those are just fun old pictures. But this is a cute little picture of my brother pretending he was pumping up a tire. And by the way, in those days, they used to patch the inner tube of a tire.
Right.
The insides, and I think I found a couple of patches out in my garage from
Really?
what Grandpa Allee had. So I might bring that in to show as a matter of interest.
Yeah.
But I thought that was such a sweet picture of my brother.
It is.
This is another picture of the age that we were, my brother and I, when we lived. Mom didn't take many pictures of herself. When we were at the Fred Adams farm, look how thin my brother was, and look at his left arm. That was an example of the bone kind of problem that he had, and he had surgery when we were there, just a few weeks probably after that, where he had his legs operated on by the doctor that I finally got to meet when I was in nurses training. And a funny story about that. He had crutches to use when he would walk. And one day he was doing so well, he left his crutches at the barn and walked to the house and hadn't noticed that he was walking without crutches. And they said, "Well, Punky, where's your crutches?" And he thought he had done something wrong. "I forgot them." He was just doing that well. That was just a good thing. We know now.
Yeah.
That's all.
That's good.
Yeah. So, and my Aunt Lula, Mom's half-sister, came up and stayed with me while my brother had surgery, and that would be kind of close to the age when they visited. That's me in the background, and Betty Lou on the right, and Linda sitting on my lap.
Hmm.
That might have been a little bit earlier, like back at the Pfizer farm. I'm not sure. But anyway, she came up and stayed with me, and we were all on the farm.
Wow.
Well, he was gone for a couple of weeks in those days. So we're good. I guess that's the ones I have organized
Okay.
for right now.
No problem. I like it.
So we were at the place on the Adams farm. I told you about the ice house,
Yeah.
and I was going to show you well, that one picture showed a little bit about the kind of equipment they had. I still hope to find some pictures of like a hay rake that sat in our edge of our field for years and rained on and everything. Just didn't phase anybody. It was just one of those things. But it was a primitive kind of thing. It had big prongs that came down, and they would just lower those and pull it. We used horses. We had a team of horses, and they knew how to work. Did all the we had all the I call it paraphernalia, but it was the the gear that you use, to I started to say steer the horses, but that's true. Anyway, it was all the equipment you need to take care of business and
Sure.
drive the horses and all that. And one was a very what you call more tame horse, and the other one was a little bit wilder, you'd call it. You trusted the one, and I don't want to say their names on the phone or okay.
Yeah.
So, um, but the one who was not as tame was very obedient with the other one as a team,
Hmm. Interesting.
So it was a interesting thing, and I'd like to have a picture of some of the equipment for the time when we used the horses, because some of it was pretty primitive. One thing I don't think I'll ever find a picture of, it was called a tobacco setter, and it was like a big barrel that had water in it, and the person driving the horses would sit on a seat that was above that barrel of water, and then at the lower end, at ground level, just barely clearing the ground, were two seats, one on the left and one on the right, and in the center of in front of the two seats was a place that dispensed a little cup or so of water, and there was a little click that seemed to happen when it was time to put the plant in, and the person on the left had this mound of tobacco plants that were just about this long and just pulled out of the tobacco bed, and one would put one plant in, and the click would happen, and it purposely covered the dirt around the plant, and then it was time for the next one. So the next person on the right would put his plant in, gave the person on the left time to get his next little plant ready,
Yeah.
and they would just go slowly down the row and plant tobacco like that.
Wow.
And
You were explaining to me at lunch how they because you have to you can't plant tobacco as a seed. You have to raise it first.
oh,
Beforehand.
right.
Can you explain that process a little?
Did you want me to explain that?
Yeah.
I can recall that really vividly from when we moved to Ohio, because that's when I helped. There was a thing where you had to kind of purify the ground to put the seeds in, so it would be free of all the seeds that might grow up and germinate and be like weeds, and then not allow the new plants to come up and be free to grow. So they would kind of purify the ground, and they would have like it was if you can visualize a chunk of wire fence and building a fire on it, and then pulling it slowly across a patch of dirt, it would burn down the plants that were there. Maybe they plowed it first too, I don't know. But they would slowly pull that burning coals of fire over the dirt so it purified it, and then it was ready for them to put seeds in. And so they would put these tobacco seeds in. You get them from the tobacco warehouse, I guess. It was interesting. They wanted to help people out. But anyway, you plant the seeds, and it was just a solid bed, probably 6 to 8 feet wide, and probably, I'm say 40 feet long, 50, maybe longer. And there were special canvases that you would buy in order to cover that, so that if it did get too cold at night or did frost and you were a little bit early getting it put out, then they would put a canvas over it. And I'll show you one of the clips in a minute of the thing that holds a canvas in the ground, because I saved some. It's in my little garden thing over there. And it was like a wire that was bent over like a prong, and it held it down securely in the ground and kept it from getting too cold, and protected it at night and kept bugs from getting into it, whatever. But it was a white canvas that it was thin, but it still was opaque. You couldn't really see through it, and it was very protective. And they allowed the plants to get to be probably 5 to 6 weeks old, and they would probably be 4 or 5 inches long or tall when you pulled them. And right at the time when it was ready that you needed to plant those, you had to do it. You didn't wait and let them get long and way out of control, because then you couldn't maneuver the plants as well, and they would get spindly or whatever. So that's when you had to plant and do it right then. And I can remember one time in Ohio, I mentioned this at noontime to you, that my dad realized it was too muddy to get into the fields with the
Give me a second.
with the planter, and he
Just 1 second. Okay, Grandma.
was it a spam risk?
Yeah, I think it was a spammer.
Oh, sorry about that.
It's okay. Continue.
So it was, and the other reason could have been because there was a little area he chose to grow the tobacco on that year that was a little bit steeper, a little bit more hilly-like, and it would have been hard to get the planter in there, the little thing that was horse-drawn. It would have been harder to get that in there than regular flat land. And by the way, they put the tobacco in a different spot each year to make the ground good and not used up of whatever it utilized in the nutrients and all that. So he said to me, "Betty, we're going to plant tobacco today." And that meant I was going to help do something. So we had this little handheld instrument, I'll call it. It was probably about 3 feet long, and it was tubular in shape, and at the base it had a little trap door that had a pointed end so that you punch that into the ground and you put a tobacco plant, a small plant, through one of the little openings at the top, and then the person who was controlling the instrument, like my dad was holding that and I would put the plant down, he would squeeze a little handle part that caused the thing to open up and let the plant fall into the ground after it punctured with the little opening down at the bottom. And then he would take his foot and tamp it to make it compacted in the ground. And that's because it was a certain kind of moisture that we already had in the soil. It had just rained, so to speak, but those plants had to get out.
Yeah.
So that's how we planted tobacco, and he would brag on me and say, "Oh, you're just doing so fine."
Yeah.
And so that kept me motivated, and we got all the tobacco planted that year.
So tell me about why tobacco was so important to somebody's farm.
Well, it was a large money crop for those years. I mean, the amount of money a person made would be absolutely minimal compared to what people earn nowadays. But as a part of the income for the family, it provided a big financial aid to help the family through the year. And my dad would grow other people's crops besides his own. He was very good at what he did, and he was a humble man, but he would just tackle growing other people's crops, and he would get half of the income from that, like he used to do when he worked on a farm as a sharecropper. So he did that, and his tobacco always did well. There was another thing of interest that people might not know, that often, I won't say every year, but we would have a bad storm with hail, and it could ruin a crop.
Wow.
Those little pellets of ice coming down through, because the tobacco leaves are a tender kind of thing, and we didn't have a lot of wind back there. I don't recall a lot. We might have had a storm and wind come up early and be a problem, but I don't remember big winds like we have out here. And so he would most years take out insurance in case it caused your crop to be destroyed by just overnight kind of thing. It was just a safety feature they did.
Wow.
And then the thing I told you about the fact that you were allowed to grow exactly the amount of tobacco that was listed according to your farm. And it had to have been a tobacco farm previously. You couldn't buy just a little place and then say, I'm going to grow some tobacco, give me an acreage to say. It had to be from its heritage, a tobacco farm. And it said on there how much you were allowed to grow, because there were times when people would grow just volumes of tobacco just to say they wanted to make a lot of money that year, and they had to take care of that not being a thing where people kind of overdid their quantity and just made all the other people, not make any money. So anyway,
So the federal government came in, and based on the size of your land, you could only grow so much.
they just told you how much you could grow. You could 1 1/10 acres, and it was as valuable as anything, because they controlled, the fact that other people couldn't just grow as much as they wanted, unending. Like if it said 1 acre and you grew 7 acres, you chopped 6 acres down.
And threw it away?
You'd have to destroy it, yeah.
Wow.
And
how did they regulate that?
there was a tobacco surveyor who came out every year and went around the perimeter of your tobacco crop and measured it. He had a little wheel that he pushed. It was probably 2.5 feet diameter, and it measured exactly how much the area was, and you were told if you had one row too much, you had to chop it down.
Wow.
And they monitored that. I can't remember if they were the ones that did it or how they came, if they came back to make sure you did it. I don't know how they did that, but I know it was a very special rule.
So tobacco being so valuable, I imagine everybody smoked. Did everybody smoke cigarettes?
Well, that's another very good question. I got to tell you about that. There were years when my grandpa and my dad had these little papers, very thin little papers, and they would take their tobacco and roll it, and they'd moisten it and seal it. But I think they found out that they made a good blend and the flavors were better for the ones that you buy. But this is the part that I was laughing about because it's another interesting little tidbit. There would be a pack where they had purchased a pack of cigarettes, but they would take maybe one out and it went up on the corner of Mom's kitchen cabinet. I kid you not.
One cigarette.
No, I mean the pack.
Oh, one pack. Okay.
They took like one out. They just didn't do it that often. They would lay that pack on top of that kitchen cabinet, and it might be there for 4 months. They only smoked, honestly, probably just when, I don't know when they even thought about it. And it was always outside. Always outside. Never, I don't remember them smoking in the house at all. But anyway, that was, isn't that interesting? They didn't really smoke all that much. There was a time when they might have done more that I didn't know about. I never did remember seeing my dad sitting around ever smoking.
How about just like other people, like in town and your friends, parents, and things like that?
They might have done enough of it at home that they didn't seem to be doing it out in town, but I'll tell you, when they did, they would be sitting outside of a door somewhere and just kind of waiting on a wife to come out from getting groceries or the dime store or something, because I didn't, and you don't see people sitting around waiting like that much in those days. Maybe they did it in the car on the way home. I don't know.
Yeah.
I will tell you something funny, and I might repeat this later when we talk about living in Decatur, but I had a neighbor, Verge Purdon, and he smoked cigars.
Oh.
Well, he didn't finish a cigar, but he had put it out, and the funny thing is he'd put it on the top of his head. He always wore a hat, and it would ride on top of his head with his hat on. It was cold. It was, they put it out and everything, but he would keep his cigar in the top of his head with his hat on, and then when he wanted to smoke, he would take it down and light it up and smoke
Wow.
with few puffs, and it was a fun little tidbit to remember him with that. But
Yeah, that's funny.
anyway, he was the one that lived next door to us. So we're back at the Adams farm still.
Yeah.
I showed you the picture of my brother posing as if he was pumping up a tire.
Yeah.
That was good.
Yeah.
And what else? I told you about the story of Snake getting in the meat house with Mom, and them having to make a phone call and have the man come home take care of that.
I don't think so.
Oh, well, that was definitely a memory. We had a freestanding house that was like, probably 20 by 40 feet, maybe 30 by 40, I don't know. And it was where they hung the meat, the hams. A very good sturdy wire was run through the knuckle end, through the meat, and held it very securely. And then it was a nice cloth bag that Mom would sew up, and it was tied at the top. And we'd put the cured hams in that, and the shoulders were just like the hams, only the shoulders was considered to be not as luxurious as the hams. They were a little more tender, not as stringy, whatever. And they would be hanging in the meat house. Well, there was still room enough in there that Mom could do her laundry in there. So she went out to do the laundry, and mind you, this is still when you would heat the water on the stove and carry it out by bucketfuls to make it, warm enough. I can't remember if she had a little gas-powered machine that she used, a little Maytag, I think. But she was getting ready to do the laundry, and she looked up, and it was summertime, and there was a snake out there, and she tried to take care of business and get it out of there, and it was just a little bit defiant. And finally, it made her nervous enough. And Mom was pretty tough. She didn't have to call for help very often, but somehow she got that thing cornered. But it went up, and it was on one of the rafters, and it was just being a little like brave, and she was so nervous about that thing that she called over to Fred Adams' farm and had them to tell my dad about the problem she had.
Wow.
And they had to come home and kind of help take care of getting that snake down.
What kind of snake was it?
I really don't remember the kind, or if it was, but we did have some copperheads and things back there.
Really?
Yeah. But we were just fortunate that we didn't have any other encounters. But
Yeah.
that was one that it somehow or other it was just kind of trapped in there. But she was so nervous about it, she had to have a little bit of help that time.
Wow.
And as I said, Mom was pretty tough. She could do about anything she needed to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. Did Punky help on the farm a lot? Like, was he out?
He would always be out and do what he could. My dad was very protective, I'll tell you that part. It had that bone surgery
Right.
on his legs, and they were very protective to not have us, do anything that was really a danger. They didn't want us around the cows. And when they did the milking, there's a thing that I'll tell you about you might not know. There are two metal clamps held together with like a chain, and they could clip that just right over. It didn't hurt at all. Put it right over the back of the legs. It was up above the leg joint, or else it was down by the feet. They were called kickers. Certain ones of the cows they knew were really tame, and other ones they didn't want a chance, but even they would put the kickers on the cows to keep them from being able to kick you when something didn't feel right or they were antsy.
Sure.
Whatever. And as I said, my mom and dad always did the milking. They didn't want us to be around the cows to have a chance of a sad story.
Yeah.
And
did it like chain the legs together, or what did it do?
it just held the clamps went on in such a way that it just held their legs securely, and they couldn't kick.
Oh, okay, got it.
the way it put on, it was just a special thing, and they couldn't do anything until they took them off,
Oh,
and it didn't hurt them, but
just kept them in place. Yeah.
it just took care of that. But anyway, my brother would do everything because they always wanted him to learn. He would hoe and do the non-dangerous kinds of things, always willing. But yeah, he helped his dad a lot.
Nice.
Did all that.
So this is the Adams farm, right?
Yes, Fred Adams Farm.
Fred Adams farm. And so how long were you here? So you said you were in second, third grade?
I'm thinking that because of the fact that I did barely know what was going on in the first grade, I'm thinking I was there for the second and third, maybe part of the fourth, because of what I was going to share with you. When we moved to Ohio, I can recall I was in the fourth grade, and as I said, we always moved in the cold time of the year before it was time to start the new planting for the next year. So it was always cold weather, and it was like January or so. And I'm guessing that's when I moved. I'm just kind of figuring that out from the historical things I'm finding out on the backs of these pictures.
Yeah.
So the Fred Adams farm is the one that I have the fondest memories to tell you about. Is things that I recall some of the most. Then we moved from there to a very small house, and we still did milking. And the way we would take care of keeping the milk ready for pickup seems to me like on the Fred Adams farm. I don't think we still took milk or cream to Maysville all the time, but when we were on the other farm, I know we did, because I was telling you about Mrs. Gollenstein. She was a lady who ran the creamery in Maysville, and you take cream in a small can that's probably 5 gallon. I have one. I could bring it in and show you. And she would use this pipette and draw up the cream. It didn't go into her mouth, but the vacuum would help her get some of it into the tester that she did. And she would test our cream and pay us for it, and give us new cans, fresh cans rather. And the cans had our names on them, so that after they were washed, you got your same cans back.
Wow.
Did
they write them on there, or was it like stamped
It's
on?
stamped on.
Really?
Yeah, and I'll bring one of those in and show you. Unless I should have had it ready today, but
Does it say Emmons on it?
um,
Or do you just have a different milk can?
a different one. I
Okay.
have one from Ripley, Ohio, that I purchased later.
Wow.
I don't have a cream one from our farm, but I have maybe. I don't know that this one up here. I don't think was from our farm. Anyway, I think I purchased them later at antique stores.
Wow.
So the cream was tested, and you got paid according to how good your cream was, and how much, of course, the volume. So then, and the Fred Adams farm is the one where you asked me about. One of my fond things I recalled was going back through the fields and picking the wild greens. And we did that only in the springtime, because then it would grow up and be kind of wiry or coarse, like old stuff gets. But these were just tender. And you'd start out with a pile this big and would cook down to this big. It would be very large in volume to make a very small amount of food. You cook that with a little bit of ham. It's fine.
Wow.
One of my good memories. And we always had a garden. So can't think of anything terribly unusual. if I could find pictures of that farm equipment that would be old stuff, it would be interesting to see. And the ones where you see where there was a tractor in front,
Mm-hmm.
that was when other people came in, harvesters that, would be hired to come in and help.
I see.
And that would be the kind of time when you'd find out how many people there were, but you fixed a big dinner so that when it was time to eat their noon meal, they didn't have to go out and lose any much time. You'd fix a big meal to feed everybody, and it was understood to be a busy time of a day when you had harvesters come to the farm. And that was too big a job for, you can see a field of hay or a field of wheat or harvesting the tobacco.
Mm-hmm.
I'll show you pictures of that later too.
Wow.
So we took, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead.
We were talking about growing the tobacco. Okay. We've got the white canvas over it, and we pull the plants and we plant them in the ground. And then you kind of make sure that the weeds don't come up and overtake the plants.
Mm-hmm.
Probably takes them a couple 3 months to grow, and then I have some good pictures, but I didn't know I was going to share that part today to know what the tobacco looks like when it's ready to be harvested. That is a big job.
Well, don't hurt yourself, Grandma.
This is something. These two things here,
Those two wooden sticks.
and I wanna share with my tobacco sticks.
These things.
That's one, yeah. Thanks. I need the other one too to tell you something. And these two little things with a handle. I forgot. I didn't know we were going to talk about that
These little
today.
machetes.
The other ones, yeah.
These little machetes.
Yep, they are for sure. Oh, there are two of them similar, huh? Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So what am I looking at here?
Okay. I wanted to show you how you can tell what an original ancient tobacco stick looks like. Now these are old ancient ones because you can tell it was stripped down through the tree where the branches set on. It caused a little curve for them to take whatever they did to go down through there. It went with a little flow of the growth of the tree.
Yeah.
And talk about ancient. It's hard to find ancient tobacco sticks. This is another one. See how the growth of the tree,
Yeah.
but yet that's as strong as it can be. I have one here that was cut at a factory type situation, and it's perfectly square. So you can tell that these were very, very old.
Wow.
So, okay, it gets to be time to see if the tobacco is ready to harvest. And it starts to give little shoots at the top with little blooms. And they go off, those are called suckers. They don't want that on there. But what they do is go through the field and break those off, and it drives the growth into the plant down below. So that causes the plant to be as mature as it's going to be able to get. They know when it's time to harvest when they look at it and say the leaves are starting to kind of maybe turn brown on some of the edges. And then you don't go through a field with any kind of equipment to cut these precious plants down. You cut them down with a tobacco. This is homemade by my dad. That's why I told you his little
machetes.
little group of there's another one.
Yeah.
His little steel things out there. He just knew how to use some of that stuff,
Yeah.
make something good out of it. And there's another kind of tobacco cutter there, which is not quite as useful as these. He must have found out later. Yeah, thank you. See, this one is a different function. You would,
How about this one?
yeah, that's a digger. That's different, but that's okay. I don't think that's a cutter. Maybe it is. Maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, this is not as effective. You shoot down and you'd have to be right on target to
Yeah.
hit. That's narrower and everything.
Yeah.
But you would cut the tobacco and allow it to kind of, oh, I know. I don't have a spear, but it was a cone-shaped, it was conical shaped, about this long, came to a sharp point, very sharp point. Wish I had saved one of those. You put it on the end of the stick, and you take the stem of the tobacco, probably this close to the place where you've cut it off, and you spear it down onto this stick until you have this stick filled with probably 7, 8 plants, long, big, drooping plants. You allow them to wilt in the field a little bit so you can handle them. If you cut it down and instantly put it on there, it would, well, maybe they did put it instantly too, but it would wilt a little bit so that it would make the leaves not damage so much. If it's real crunchy, it would break if you handle it a lot. So it had to be in the field and wilt a little bit, get a little bit mellow, and then they would go out and load all these sticks of tobacco. I have great pictures in there to show you, but I thought that was a different day.
That's okay.
And they would allow it to, they would punch the stick in the ground at a kind of an angle, and it had to be the right kind of weather to do this harvesting also, because if it was going to rain, you didn't want rain to come down on that tobacco and have to dry all those droopy leaves.
Yeah.
You would make sure it was a nice sunny warm day, and then you take that out, punch it in the ground, and allow it to kind of wilt a little bit. Then you go and load it up and put it in layers on a, we had a sled drawn by horses, and later we probably had a wagon drawn by a tractor. But you take it to the barn, and then someone gets way up in the top of the barn, and another person on a different set of rails, and the rails were just wide enough like this, probably 4 feet wide, to hang these on a rail so it drooped down and allowed it to dry and get just right for the time when you pick the leaves off. And that would be 2 to 3 months maybe, and you'd have to pick the right kind of weather even for that. If you get it when it's too dry and brittle, then the leaves would be crumbly and fall off when you try to take them off of these dehydrated stalks.
Yeah.
And then you put a certain kind of leaf together from the bottoms of the plant. You pick those off and put them in with a grouping. Then you take another leaf of the same kind and fold it over and wrap it around this what we call a hand of tobacco. It would be all bushy like this. You know, you get them all grouped together. You'd have a hand of tobacco. You take one leaf and wrap it around, and then you'd tuck it down through the bottom of where those leaves were, leave it long enough to do that, and then you'd compress it. We have a thing called a tobacco press.
Wow.
Until you got all these hands of tobacco put onto, I guess it was another stick,
Hmm.
and then compressed it, and then you hauled it off to that big uh, tobacco warehouse on a day when it was all scheduled for pickup, and take it down there, and the people would go through. An auctioneer would make all this. Have you heard an auctioneer talk
Yeah.
before? One time I was very small in Maysville, I guess it was, and I was talking about that man that was yodeling, and they called him over to tell him what I had said, and that was supposed to be funny, but I was just a little tiny girl, and I said, "Where's that man yodeling?" But it was such an entertaining thing to get to go to the warehouse at sales time.
Yeah.
And as I said, my dad was so good at what he was doing that he always got top dollar for his tobacco.
Really?
Yeah, he always got good good income from his tobacco.
Wow.
It caused us to be able to have the money for next year's crop,
Yeah.
the seed corn and all the stuff that you have to buy,
Hmm.
along with the selling of the milk that we did each day.
Did your mom grow tobacco in her later years?
The farm always produced tobacco. She would rent it out, and they would be the sharecropper to help her.
Oh, I see. Even around the time I was born?
Mhm. Yeah, tobacco.
Because I remember going, just real faint memories when you guys took me out there,
Yes.
and there was there was some shed, and it was like the both the doors were like kind of halfway open.
Mhm.
It was real dark inside, and I
Mhm.
just saw something like hanging, rows and rows of hanging stuff.
Yeah, I've got pictures. I could almost go in there and grab them for you for today while we're talking about that to make it interesting. But the barns for the tobacco had a long, slender door on the outside that you could open for ventilation
Mm.
and let air flow through, and that helped to dry the tobacco and
Yeah.
cure it. That's what they call it, curing the tobacco.
I see.
So,
I remember as a kid, it looked scary. Like I was like, "What's in there?"
oh yeah,
It looks, I don't know, just
and
looks
it
scary.
was just full of green hanging tobacco, probably, or else it was already turning brown from drying out.
Wow. Did your mom ever retire and stop working, or like?
What she did was, when my dad, well, she rented the crop out to who could handle it. One of our neighbors grew the crop for years, and she was working at the hospital. Remember that when he got sick, and she had sold some of the cows off, but there was still one or two. I can't remember how many, but that was the famous thing about her going down and milking one of the cows, and helping him with his bath, and sometimes driving to Cincinnati and back.
Mhm.
There's a story about that in there I'll tell you about. But she never did retire until it was retiring time. Yeah, she was she worked for many years at the hospital.
Wow.
So,
So she sharecropped. The other people grew crops on her land, and then
on her land.
she got a percentage of that. Okay,
Mhm.
that makes sense.
Yeah. So
Um,
she kept growing tobacco, and as far as I know, the farm was sold with the allotment of tobacco that was allowed to be grown on it still.
so that rule extends to today.
Evidently, yes.
Wow. Okay,
Mhm.
interesting.
It was current when I left the last I knew. Yeah.
Yeah. So this house you moved to after the Fred Adams farm, you guys
Okay.
moved to another house, right?
I'm wondering if that farm was also owned by Fred Adams. I don't remember another landlord. My dad always got along with whoever it was, but he was wise and able to save up to finally buy the farm that we did in Ohio. So, however he did that was by, raking and scraping and doing all that later. but it was a tiny little house, really small, and I'm confident we lived there maybe just a year.
Okay.
I'm just guessing. I have some memories of that, but I think I started first grade because I went to a different school.
Oh.
Schools were very closely located back there, as far as you just had just a lot of schools. They believed in the education of kids. But there was a place called Mays Lick. And as we go to that farm, I'll tell you something interesting about where it was located. Probably 2, maybe 3 miles down the road was a thing called, it was like a mansion. And a lot of farms were built so that they were like off the road. Like the one on Fred Adams was probably 1.5 to 2 miles off the road.
Oh.
And when they brought us out, they had to bring us out every day to meet the school bus. They had to go through a little creek just before you got to the road, the main road. And that old saying about if the creek don't rise, you can go to school, so to speak. But sometimes we have little storms, and the creek would be much higher, so they had to be aware of that. But it was way too far to ever walk for us kids,
Wow.
and we would drive past another. Um, there was 2 sisters that lived in a house very close to the lane edge, and they were called the Weddle sisters. And we could almost see in their living room because it was that close, probably 15 to 20 feet from the little lane edge. And we'd ride past their house and then a little further still and then go down that little creek and then up to where the road was. And they'd have to always take us to the bus. Always. It was never a question.
Mm.
And if we did not have them to meet us, they had us to get off the bus at the Fred Adams farm, where the man who owned the house, he had a couple of children, and they were always good to us. And so they would have the message to say, have them get off at the Fred Adams farm today. Yeah, it was all very good.
So you switched schools and you started first grade.
Mm-hmm.
How small were these schools, like student-wise and building-wise?
I would say we probably had 20 or 30 in the first grade, maybe probably 20. I'm remembering the size of the room, and I think that the high school was in a different building. It was a very elegant building at a different area. So when we started at school in Flemingsburg, the grade school we went to was not the place where we would have gone if we'd gone through high school. And it was an exceptional building, very, very different looking. Like it seems to me like it was like a blue and white stone, and just like a really luxurious looking thing on the way as you drive from Maysville to Flemingsburg. By the way, it's only 17 miles from Maysville to Flemingsburg.
Mm.
And Lewisburg is in between. That's the next place we went, the Fred Adams farm. And there's an interesting thing I'll tell you about. In Lewisburg, there is a kind of a curve that goes around the road that they had built as they built the road, so to speak. And I don't know if you've ever heard of a cowboy named Tom Mix, famous in our day.
Mm.
Famous, like a Roy Rogers, only Roy Rogers wasn't talked about yet then. But he did like famous tricks with a horse. And as they were right there on that curve in Lewisburg, the horse got killed in transit. And
Really?
it was just a well-known thing in those days that we said that was where the horse had gotten the kill. And at the time, we used to know his name and everything.
Wow.
But it was Tom Mix. You can look it up in history and see that he was a famous cowboy in those days. And that's what happened right there in Lewisburg.
Wow.
But anyway, Lewisburg is between Flemingsburg and Maysville. So we didn't move very far from one place to the next. And I told you about the Helena Church. That is an Indian name, Helena. And the thing about Helena is most of Mom's relatives are buried there. There's a cemetery, famous,
Really?
well-known cemetery. It's up on a hill, not a giant hill, but just an incline, kind of sloping little area, perfect for such a thing. And the Helena Church must not be very far from there. I'm just trying it because I was a child, but we went to the Helena Church from all those different places. That's how close it was.
Okay. Wow.
So as we were driving to church, we would drive past this mansion. It was something that you would see in like an English movie. Like I can't it wasn't like the one that's famous that was in the movie that was recently done.
Was it plantation-esque, or was it more like Oxford English castle style?
Like Cat Castle style.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was the banker's house.
Really?
His name was Jim Finch. See,
Huh.
I can still remember his name. But we'd drive past his mansion, you'd call it.
Wow.
And on the way to church, to and from church, Helena.
Was he a respected man in the community, or?
Oh, yeah, he was well known. He didn't come to our church. I don't know if he went to church, period. I'm not sure about that part. But he was the banker in Maysville,
Wow.
Jim Finch. Yeah.
Interesting.
So one of the interesting things about driving from Lewisburg to Maysville is you go around a road, I think it was called 68, and there were chunks out of the edge of the hillside so that you could always see the pretty stones, and in the winter ice would be always hanging like icicles on the rocks where the stones were kind of layered, but you could see that on the way, and that was just a fun thing to get to see. That was all good.
Very nice. And so you went to school, first grade. The class size was like 30.
Probably, yes.
What were the teachers like back then? Was it very strict?
They were not strict or mean or anything. I just didn't know what was going on.
Wow, what do you mean?
I was still, I just did not understand. It was all so different for me to go. And
because this was the beginning of your schooling. You didn't have preschool.
No preschool.
There was no kindergarten.
No, nothing like that.
So most kids started at what, first grade? So this was all very new to you, like you said.
Yeah, it was just something that was so, I was so used to being just quiet. And as you said, what did you do when you went to church? We sat by our mom and dad and didn't really understand. We could hear and understand the words that were being said. All that was good. But it wasn't done at any kind of level where children would be like excited, and it was just very matter of fact. So I was very matter of fact when I went to school too. And it was a kind of thing that I just remember I just didn't quite catch on till I was in the fourth grade. Began to click a little bit.
Found your stride.
And then the 5th grade, I began to really listen to the teachers. It was interesting. And um, the 6th grade, I can remember all that. But I remember going to school in the 4th grade over at Decatur. And that was the beginning of my final understanding of it was schooling was business to learn.
Yeah.
So I did.
And so were you in this new house until later? Like how many years were you in? You said 1 year, right? You were in that new house after the Fred Adams farm?
Yeah, just 1 year, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
And then you moved to
Decatur, where we had a long, long life there.
Okay, so you stayed mostly in Decatur then?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Interesting.
Yeah.
And what was that house like in Decatur?
Decatur?
Yeah.
It was a small house compared to the big houses we had lived in, those big old houses in Kentucky. But it had like four downstairs. It was like a salt box, you might call it. 4 rooms downstairs, same size, and 2 little rooms upstairs, and then a little walk-in attic. And one of the interesting things was that after you did all the work of growing a garden and canning and saving all your vegetables or fruit, whatever, it got to be so cold that the summer house could not keep the food from freezing. And if you have something in a glass jar and it freezes, it breaks.
Right, yeah.
So there was a day in the fall when we got serious about moving that fruit all the way up to upstairs and put it as near the chimney as we could so it would not freeze.
In the attic?
In the attic.
Okay, wow.
And it was all on the floor in the attic, and it was like a roof that came up, and you had to bend over as you walked further into the room. So we just had our fruit there. It didn't freeze for some reason.
Really?
And there was no great insulation up there, but just the warmth of the fact there was the heat from the chimney kept the fruit from going bad.
Wow.
So we did that. And in that house, we took the nice big stove that my dad bought at the Fred Adams farm, the Home Comfort, that big giant stove that we had.
Yeah.
And it took up enough room in the kitchen that it was kind of at an angle in one of the corners. And then there was a little sink. You just used the sink for washing the dishes, but there wasn't any running water in the sink. It was we had to go to the well and bring the water in, of course. Oh yeah.
Wow.
So it was.
What was your favorite house that you lived in? Which one did you like the most?
Favorite. You know, if I had been old enough to know better, I would say that first one, the Weaver farm, but I wasn't old enough to say that I understood I just know the history of it and what it would be like for me now.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say the Fred Adams farm. Oh, it had such fond memories for me to just the life there, you know.
Yeah.
That's the pictures that you saw of my brother with the tire pump, and he had the surgery there, and me with funny little dresses on. So that would be a kind of an interesting place to say, because the next house was very small, the one that we moved to for that 1 year. I'm pretty sure it was just 1 year, and then to Ohio. I had the fondest memories of Ohio because I was more grown up and able to understand a little bit more about life and my mom and dad and all that. But
well, how about we take a pause at Decatur and we'll pick up next time?
okay,
What do you
sounds
say?
good to me. Yeah.
I love you, Grandma.
I love you more.